We're going to go until 9:30. That's going to be tough. And the reason is because this is a tough passage anyway. I mean, this is a tough passage if you're fresh in the morning, just having a nice cup of tea or something. So if you will dig in with me, we're going to look at Paul and the New Covenant. And what we're going to look at is one passage that is regularly used to discount everything I taught in the first session. Okay? Essentially, when I've talked with people and they say, and I talk to them about what I understand Jeremiah to have been saying about the New Covenant, they say, wait a minute, let's go read Paul in 2 Corinthians 3. And so that's exactly what we're going to do, okay?
That guy causes a lot of trouble, that Paul, doesn't he?
Yes, that guy Paul can be misunderstood, according to Peter. It says he is misunderstood. How does it say? He says that they twist his teachings as they do the other scriptures. Yeah, that section in Peter. Okay, good. So, 2 Corinthians 3, Paul's use of Old Covenant versus New Covenant. Let's get some background to this passage. First of all, at Corinth, Paul's ministry or his work for Yeshua was being challenged. Others were saying he had no authority. Now, I just want to stop here and talk about one of my pet peeves. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. Everybody has to have a pet peeve here and there. I hear a lot of people in the Messianic communities referring to Paul as Rav Shaul or Rabbi Shaul. Did you know that Paul, after he came to faith in Yeshua, we never hear him referring to himself as Saul? He never calls himself Saul, an apostle. Why does he always use Paul? Paul was a name given to him at birth because, from everything that we understand, Paul was born as a Roman citizen, meaning that his parents probably were pioneers in an area and were granted citizenship as a result of their willingness to pioneer. Okay? Like up in Tarsus. And therefore, Paul was born with a citizenship. He says this, doesn't he, in Acts? He says to one of the Roman rulers, you bought it with a great price, but I was born, right, with citizenship. So a Roman citizen had to have a Roman name. So he was given the name Paulos. His Hebrew name was Shaul. Why does he constantly refer to himself by his Greek name, by his Latin or Roman name?
He's not Jewish anymore?
Yeah. So some people would say, well, that's because he gave up his Jewishness. But we know that's not the case. He says at the end of Acts, he says, I've done nothing against the traditions of my people or against the Torah, against the law. And he says, I worship in the same manner as my forefathers. He even says at the trial, he doesn't say, I was a Pharisee. What does he say? I am a Pharisee. Wait a minute. So why did he keep referring to himself as Paul? Here's why. Because Paul had come to the conclusion, by the revelation of God, that Gentiles and Jews have the same status in God's family. A Hebrew name is not better than a Greek name in God's family. And he was the apostle to the Greeks, right? To the Gentiles. He said, okay, I'll use my Gentile name. I'm not a Gentile, I'm a Jew. But I'm not any different than my Gentile brother, right? Because
couldn't that be a translational issue? Like we have Mark. I mean, there's no Mark, Matthew, Luke, and so our King James people.
Well,
just applied to Paul.
Okay, there's a question on the floor. Is it a translation? No, it's not. In the Greek, you have Paulos, and just like you have a Greek equivalent of Matityahu, Matthew, and so forth and so on. Now, I grant that your King James Version translates Yaakov as James. It should be Jacob. And that, by the way, was not because of King James, because the earlier versions, including the Geneva and the Wycliffe, also translate the name Yaakov in the Greek as James. Okay, so some of that. But it's not translation. He constantly referred to himself as Paul, an apostle of the Messiah Yeshua. And here's another thing. I don't think Paul ever received rabbinic ordination. I think he certainly could have. He was at the head of his class. But when he came to faith in the Messiah, Yeshua, he left and went out somewhere for 3 years, right? We have this lost years of Paul before we read about him again. He left his rabbinic training. And by the time he came back, he was not all that appreciated by at least some of the leaders in Jerusalem. I don't think he ever got rabbinic ordination, or what is called smicha, the laying on of hands. When he comes to the Corinthians then, they say, where are your credentials? What right do you have to tell us anything? You persecuted us before. Now all of a sudden you're coming and we're supposed to listen to you? And by the way, you never finished your seminary. If I can use that metaphor. You never got the degree. They were saying he had no credentials. Paul's response was to ask the Corinthians to consider what God had done through his ministry. The Corinthians were his credentials. First week of college, a man who was well known in that particular denomination, and a wonderful man actually, and quite a fine speaker, gave a 1 week series of lessons to all of the student body at the college, and the name of his talks were The High Cost of Writing Paper. Now, I know that does date me, but it used to be, for those of you that don't know, when you went to college, you bought a lot of writing paper because you took a lot of notes with a pen and a pencil and paper instead of with your laptop, and you turned all of your things in writing and that kind of a thing. And so we understood the high cost of writing paper. That's not what he was talking about. He was talking about the Corinthians. He said, because Paul says, you are my letters. You are my credentials. You're my writing paper. How much did that cost? It cost God the life of his son, Yeshua. And then Paul compares his ministry with the ministry of Moshe. Now that's dangerous. When you're talking to a group of people who have revered somebody as high as Moshe, you're in troubled waters when you start comparing your work to his work, because it's almost certain you're never going to be able to measure up. Let's read it. He says, are we beginning to commend ourselves again? Or do we need as some letters of commendation to you or from you? You are our letter, written on our hearts, known and read by all men. What does he mean by that? When people look at what has changed in your life, when people see what's gone on in your community, they know something's changed. They know something. You're our credentials. Being manifested that you are a letter of Messiah, cared for by us, written not with ink, but with the Ruach of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. Such confidence we have through Messiah toward God, not that we are adequate in ourselves to consider anything as coming from ourselves, but our adequacy is from God. In other words, it's not our training, it's not our acumen, it's not our intellectual abilities, it's not even our wisdom and so forth that has made the difference in you as a community. It's what God has done. Does that written on tablets of human hearts remind you of anything we recently studied? Yeah, he's got the new covenant in mind. Right. Such confidence we have through Messiah toward God. Not that we are adequate in ourselves to consider anything as coming from ourselves, but our adequacy is from God, who also made us adequate as servants of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. Now here's the phrase, for the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. If you look at the majority of Christian commentators, you're going to see a good many of them say, here is proof that the Torah kills and the Spirit makes alive. It says it, doesn't it? Not of the letter, but of the Spirit. And he talks about a new covenant. For the letter kills, but the Spirit brings life. But if the ministry of death, now we're even getting more strategic. What is the ministry of death? Well, we've heard it many times. The ministry of death is the Torah. Frankly, if you look at some Messianic communities, you might agree with that. Somehow we tend to get off track. And let me just pause here and put something to you that is a mantra for me in that best sense of the word. If Yeshua is not in the middle of all that we do, if his glory is not the highest goal of our lives, both individually and communally, we have missed the mark. We want to live Torah the way Yeshua lives Torah. We want to love Torah the way Yeshua loves Torah. I call Yeshua sometimes when I've talked with my Jewish friends and especially my leaders and rabbis and so forth, I call him my Rebbe. You know what a Rebbe is? He's the teacher, he's the rabbi that all of his followers want to be just like him. I was in Toronto some years ago in the Jewish section and was eating in a little cafe. And at first there was 4 or 5 of us that we were all friends and together we were eating. Then all of a sudden all these guys came in, black hats. You know what I mean by black hats? You know, they're super Orthodox. But these black hats were wearing their hats crazy. Instead of wearing them normally, they were like way back on their head so that you saw the first part of the... And I thought to myself, what is going on? And I'm not afraid to ask people that I've never met before. I went up to them and I said, we were eating here and having a great time, and you're obviously a group together. How do you know? I mean, how are you grouped together? He said, we're all from such and such yeshiva down the road. I said, oh, great. Wonderful. And, we chit-chatted a bit. I said, I got to ask you, why do you wear your hats back on your head like that? I said, oh, that's the way our Rebbe wears it. And he wasn't smiling. If the Rebbe wears his hat that way, that's the way, and we're his disciples. We do what he does. When the Orthodox rabbi in our city knocked on my door and had been given my name as some Jew that needs to return to Judaism, and so he came in and he looked, he said, oh, Orthodox Jew in Tacoma, that's amazing. He said, come on in. I said, let's talk. And he said, sat down. The first thing he asked me, did you wear tefillin this morning? Because the Chabad, they believe that if every Jewish male in one generation wears tefillin, then the Messiah will return. Or come. Messiah will come. Yeah, I would say return. I said, yeah, I laid tefillin this morning. He said, can I see your tefillin? I said, sure. I bought them in Jerusalem. So I showed it to him, and he said, oh, they're too small. He said, would you put mine on? He brought the his big ones out. I said, oh, sure, no problem. So I put them on, said the blessing, whatever, make him happy, big deal. And he said, why do you wear such small tefillin? I said, my Rebbe told me to. Right? Yeah. Matthew 23. He said, do not make your tefillin big. In other words, don't be a show-off. Put the tefillin on for the right reasons. He looked at me and said, you're Rebbe? I said, yeah, Yeshua HaMashiach. He goes, oh, you're Messianic. I said, yeah. You see, the point that I'm making, and I want to go back to it, Yeshua is our Master. He is our Lord. He is our Savior. He gave His life for us. He is the head. All glory should be given to Him. Let us never, ever think that we could in any way set Him to the side. Paul says that for of Him and through him and to him are all things. Now you say, wait, he's talking about the Father there. Go back and read it and see if that's not Yeshua at the end of Romans 11. All right, let's go on. If the ministry of death in letters engraved on stones came with glory, so that the sons of Israel could not look intently on the face of Moses because of the glory of his face. Now, what is he talking about? Right? He's talking about when Moshe went up to the mountain to get the Torah, right? And he came back down and his face was shining, right? Fading as it was, how will the ministry of the Spirit fail to be even more with glory? So he's putting at odds the ministry of death and the ministry of the Spirit. For if the ministry of condemnation, now that must be the same as the ministry of death, he's just used a different phrase, has glory, much more does the ministry of righteousness, that must be parallel with the ministry of the Spirit. So we have ministry of death engraved on stones, which is the same as the ministry of condemnation. And we have the ministry of the Spirit, which is parallel to or the same as the ministry of righteousness. So if the ministry of condemnation has glory, much more does the ministry of righteousness abound in glory. For indeed, what had glory in this case has no glory because of the glory that surpasses it. It's like if you have a little teeny flashlight that hardly has any light, and then somebody turns on all of the lights, the bright lights of the auditorium, it's like your flashlight's not even on. So even though the ministry of Moshe and his face shining was glory, when you put it in context of the glory of Yeshua, Moshe's glory is like hardly seen. For indeed, what had glory in this case has no glory because of the glory that surpasses it. For if that which fades away was with glory, much more that which remains is in glory. Therefore, having such hope, we use great boldness in our speech, and are not like Moses, who used to put a veil over his face, so that the sons of Israel would not look intently at the end of what was fading away. Well, that's kind of a hard sentence to understand, isn't it? Have you studied this portion? He put a veil over his face. For what reason? So that the sons of Israel would not look intently at the end of what was fading away. So it sounds like what Paul is telling us is, when Moses put a veil over his face, it was so that, because he was embarrassed that the glory of his face was fading away. He didn't want the Israelites to see that. He wanted them to believe that his face was still shining, but even though it wasn't, it was fading away, he put a veil over it. Doesn't it sound like that? Yeah. But their minds were hardened. For until this day, at the reading of the Old Covenant, there's the one time we have it. The reading of the Old Covenant, the same veil remains unlifted. Paul's using this as a nice midrash, a nice metaphor. Let's keep up with it. Don't get discouraged. We're going to untangle it if we can. Because it is removed in Messiah. But to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their heart. Now, do you notice we have the Old Covenant? It says, for until this very day, at the reading of the Old Covenant, and then he says it again, but to this very day, whenever Moses is read. So wouldn't that tell us that Old Covenant and Moses is the same? See, you can see why this passage is just, people say, look, everything that you taught in the first session, it's wrong. Because this contradicts everything you said. But whenever a person turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is the Ruach, and where the Ruach of the Lord is, there is liberty. And that's usually understood to mean we don't have to do all that stuff anymore. Right? We're at liberty to do without it. But we all with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as from the Lord, the Spirit, or the Ruach. So, but their minds were hardened. Talks about a veil lies over their heart. He's using good parallelism. He's saying things twice. And the liberty therefore is what? Well, good question. We have to find out. What is this veil? And how does it fit? Whenever you read a text and you keep seeing the same word used time and again, you got to know that that's important. There's something here that he's teaching us that we need to understand that we maybe don't understand. And he even talks about being unveiled. So we have veil, 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 and unveiled. Apparently this veil is important for what Paul wants to teach us here. Let's see if we can untangle it. First, a summary. The Corinthians themselves were proof of how the Ruach used Paul's ministry. He didn't need some written document from Gamaliel or something else saying that he was worthy to be listened to. Apparently, Paul's opponents were teaching one needed to become a Jewish proselyte in order to be a member of the covenant. That I just derived from the fact of what we read in Galatians and other places. From the opponent's viewpoint, one became a proselyte by submitting to the rabbinic ritual. One maintained the status of proselyte by obeying Torah. Now, what do we mean by that? Let's use just common terms that are used today. You get saved by being a Jew. You keep being saved by keeping Torah. You get in by your Jewish status. You stay in by being obedient. That sounds to me like what they were teaching. Now, this is later Mishnah. I recognize it, but perhaps it gives us an insight. This is what the Mishnah says. Mishnah was written, the Mishnah existed long before it was written, but its final writing was from between 120 and 200, okay, by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. All Israelites have a share in the world to come. What does that mean? If you're in Israel, you're in. Right. We have a group of Dutch Reformed up north of us in Seattle, and there's a little saying, if you're not Dutch, you're not much. I know I don't mean to, they're good brothers and sisters in the Lord, but nonetheless, the same thing was going on in the first century. Look, if you're not Jewish, but listen, if you're not Jewish, we got a way you can become Jewish. A little more difficult for you guys than for you gals, but no problem. We've got a way that it can happen, okay? As it is said, your people also shall be all righteous. But that's not exactly what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew of Isaiah 60 verse 21 says, your people are all righteous, not will be. That's somewhat of a translation issue that your English Bibles have put in. They shall inherit the land forever, the branch of my planting, the work of my hands, that I may be glorified. Isaiah 60:21. These are the ones who have no portion in the world to come. These are the ones who are not part of Israel. He who says the resurrection of the dead is a teaching which does not derive from the Torah. Who would that be? Sadducees. Right. And the Torah does not come from heaven. Well, there were some who were saying that only the 10 words were acceptable. Everything else Moses wrote and we're not sure about it. An Epicurean. What's that? A foreign, a pagan religion. And Akiva says, also he who reads the heretical books. So if you spend your time reading Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and so forth, you're in trouble. And he who whispers over a wound and says, I will put none of the diseases upon you which I have put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. Who would that be? That would be those who try to use the Torah for magic. And probably try to make money on it by telling people they can cure them with a magical cure. By the way, the Greek and Roman culture was extremely superstitious. Abba Saul says also, he who pronounces the divine name as it is spelled out. Okay, so what do we have here? We have an early rabbinic document that says everybody that's in Israel is saved, except for the ones who do these dastardly things. So if you do dastardly things, you lose it. But if you're born with it, you got it. Now, God had promised eternal salvation to all of Israel, is how they understood Isaiah 60, verse 21. One therefore receives salvation simply by being born an Israelite. In other words, if you were to have asked, as far as I can tell, if you would have asked the leaders of the Jewish nation, are you saved by works? They would say no. No, they would not maybe understand saved by works, but they might still. But They would say, no, I didn't do anything to get this. I was born this way. I'm fortunate I was born a Jew. Or some say I was unfortunate, but regardless, as far as God's concerned, I'm fortunate. One, therefore, receives salvation simply by being born. It's a matter of God's grace. A Gentile could obtain this status as a proselyte. Salvation was based upon one's status as a Jew. Now, I think in many cases, this is how Paul uses the word flesh. Do you rely on the flesh for your salvation? What does that mean? Do you rely on your being Jewish? He's saying that's going to get you nowhere. In fact, it's going to bring you condemnation. That's why he tells the Galatians, don't believe the lie that receiving Jewish legal status from some man saves you. That's just going to bring you condemnation. And, by the way, he uses circumcision as a short way of talking about that, because that was the most obvious last step, near to the last step, of becoming a proselyte, at least for a man. One maintained one's Jewish status by keeping Torah, that is, not doing something which resulted in being cut off from the people of Israel. What is the Torah's message of salvation? That God accredits the status of righteous to those who exercise faith. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness, right? Saving faith is the result of the Spirit writing the Torah on the heart. That's the new covenant. Saving faith results in changed lives, lives marked by righteousness. God's covenant always envisioned both Jews and Gentiles entering by faith. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. You see what I'm saying? There's no basis whatsoever in any portion of the Scripture, Tanakh or Apostolic Scriptures, where God gave some ceremony whereby a Gentile could become a Jew. He doesn't want Gentiles to become Jews, and he doesn't want Jews to act like Gentiles. That is, unsaved Gentiles, pagans. Okay? No, what does he want? He wants a family made up of Jew and Gentile who equally love each other, support each other, and live the same way in the righteous ways of God. Why is that so important? Say, Tim, why is that so important? Because he promised it. He said, in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Until the nations of the earth are blessed, God isn't seen to be faithful to his word. If all the Gentiles become Jews, then can we say God has blessed all the nations? No, he's blessed the Jews. Is God the God of the Jews only? No. Paul makes that very clear in Romans 3. So what is it? By the way, who are the adopted people in God's family?
Everyone.
That's exactly right. How many natural sons are there in God's family? One. One natural son. Everybody else is adopted. My wife and I have had the supreme privilege of adopting two beautiful orphan girls from West Africa, Liberia. And we understand now more practically what it feels like to have adopted children. But I can tell you, we didn't know if this was possible. We've talked to other adoptive parents. They didn't know if it was possible. I remember saying to my wife, men don't like to admit fears, but I have a fear. She said, what is it? I said, I don't know if I'm going to be able to love them the way I love my sons. I mean, we're bringing strangers into our house. They're different color. They're different culture. We haven't known them for the first 6 or 7 years of their life. I guarantee you, you will love your adopted children the same way you love your naturally born children. And what do the Scriptures say? As he is, so are we in the world. And how is he in the world? What happened when he went down and did the mikveh? He came up out of the water, the Ruach descended in the form of a dove, and what did we hear the voice of the Almighty say? This is the Son I love. Are you in Yeshua? Are you in Messiah? It doesn't matter who your parents were. In terms of God saying to you, I love you, Mr. Goldstein, and I love you, Mr. O'Nally, and I love you, Mr. Morales, and I love you, whomever it is, I love you all the the same. I love you as I love my son. You're all my adopted children. From every nation, every tribe, every kindred, every tongue, standing before the throne and giving praise to this one, right? It's not until that happens that God is seen to be ultimately and fully faithful to his word. Where two or three are gathered together, the phone usually rings. Or somebody spills the milk, one of the two.
Wife's got a newborn. I got an excuse.
Okay. Oh, yes, you do. You have an obligation more than an excuse. And I know I've gotten off a bit on a tangent here, but it's my heart to do so. Nothing grieves me more, and I think it grieves the heart of God as well, that in our movement, in our Torah movement, there are some who want to begin once again to divide Jew and Gentile away from each other. They're afraid that the Jews are going to lose their identity. I don't know why my Jewish brothers and sisters think that, because we've never, ever been able to lose our identity, even though we've tried as hard as we possibly could. Have we? No. God's not going to allow that. And I don't know what the problem is if a whole bunch of people think there's all of a sudden a lot more Jews. I really don't know what the problem is with that. You know, in the 2010 census down in Tacoma, Washington, they said there was 480 people that registered as Jews. That's not very many. That's hardly any. What would have happened if all of a sudden people started saying in Tacoma, you know what, there's Jews everywhere we go. I see these Jews wearing these funny things on their, fringes, and I see them getting together here and there on Saturday, and they come into the stores around Yom Kippur and they, around Pesach or Passover, and they're buying all this stuff. We can't keep it on the shelves. What's going on? Have we been invaded by the Jews? I don't know. As a Jewish person, I think that'd be wonderful. Really, the more the merrier, right? So I don't have any problem with my Gentile brother looking like a Jew, acting like a Jew, or, but that's not really Jew, is it? It's just obeying God. The Torah is not Jewish, right? The Torah is eternal. It's God's word. It's God's revelation of himself. So God's covenant has always envisioned Jews and Gentiles entering by faith. He says, in your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Now, Paul goes on in our text to compare himself to Moses. Let's look at this comparison. People disobeyed Moses' message, right? What happened when he brought the Torah down from Sinai? What was the next thing the people did? They made a golden calf, right? What happened when Paul came to Corinth? What did they do? They received the message. They began to obey the message. Paul says that when they read the Old Covenant, they disobey. When they read the New Covenant, it's one of obedience. He says that the letter on stone brings death, but the ruach on the heart brings life. Well, which is it? Is the Torah, is the letter written on the heart? Or just on stone? Let's see how they're contrasted. Moses. How many people died at Sinai? Yeah, 3,000. A lot of people died at Sinai. After Moses came down, and he smashed the tablets, and then these fiery serpents were put out, and all kinds of people died. It resulted in death. And many were condemned, right? What happened to the glory on his face? He put a veil over his face. So the glory was veiled. It's therefore less glorious. And what did the people say? Don't talk to us anymore. Please. Enough. And they grumbled at Moses. Talks about the letter. What about Paul? How does he contrast his own? His own ministry resulted in life. Many of the Corinthians believed, and it changed their life. They left their idols, right? They went away from the idolatry of Corinth. They lived in righteousness. The glory of Yeshua was seen in their lives. People had seen that they had changed. So it was more glorious than what happened with Moses. And they had believing hearts rather than hard ones, and the activity of the Ruach was clear. Right? I mean, when you read 1 Corinthians 12 through 14, what do you hear Paul saying? There's something going on here that is fantastic. Now, it's being misused in some cases, but it's still fantastic. Why was Moses' ministry less effective? This is what Paul's saying. Moses' ministry was less effective. You know what? Moses preached the same message as Paul did. They didn't have a different message. It says in Deuteronomy 30, verse 11, "For this commandment which I command you today is not too difficult for you, nor is it out of reach. It is not in heaven that you should say, 'Who will go up to heaven for us to get it for us and make us hear it, that we may observe it?' Nor is it beyond the sea that you should say, 'Who will cross the sea for us to get it for us and make us hear it, that we may observe it?' But the word is very near you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may observe it." Now, this text right here should put to rest this idea that God gave the Torah to Israel to prove that they couldn't do it. Have you heard that? Have you heard that story? So God gave Israel the law like a ball and a chain around their leg, and eventually they'd get sick and tired of having this weight on them and say, "Please, relieve us from this burden." And God finally would then abolish the Torah, take it away, and everything would be wonderful. But that's not what it says. It says, "This commandment which I gave you is not too difficult for you." It's in your mouth, in your heart. It's part of you. Did you know that Paul quotes this very text in Romans 10? He says, "But the righteousness based on faith speaks as follows." Wait a minute. This is the righteousness based on faith? "Do not say in your heart, 'Who will ascend into heaven?' That is to bring Messiah down." Now again, he's making another nice midrash, another nice kind of an example of the text, using it as an illustration. That is to bring Messiah down. Why would he equate Messiah with the Torah? Because he is the living Torah. He is the Word. You know, it says in Deuteronomy 30, which we just read, "The Word is not far from you." What Word? Yeah. Paul says, "Oh, the Word? I know I can make a nice little illustration on that. Yeshua is the Word." Now, in the context of Deuteronomy 30, he's clearly talking about the written Torah. But Paul says, if you really want to know the Torah, who do you have to learn from? Yeshua. He's the Word. So when he says, when Moses says, the commandment is not far from you, that you have to go out into heaven to get it, or out into the sea, in the deep to get it, he says, this is the same way with the Messiah. That is, to bring the Messiah down. Or, who will ascend into the abyss? That is, to bring Messiah up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. And what is that word? The word of faith which we are preaching. The very same thing that Moses said is what we're preaching. There it is. That's what Paul wrote. Take it or leave it. He's saying the message of Moses is the same message we're preaching. The righteousness based on faith. So it's all about the Messiah, who is the Word. That is the word of faith. Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians 3, Moses' ministry was less effective because the glory of God was veiled. Therefore, having such hope, we use great boldness in our speech and are not like Moses, who used to put a veil over his face so that the sons of Israel would not look intently at the end of what was fading away. But their minds were hardened. For until this very day at the reading of the Old Covenant, the same veil remains unlifted. So, why was Moses' ministry less effective? The same Spirit was at work in Moses' day. Numbers 11 says, "Then I will come down and speak with you there, and I will take the Spirit who is upon you," that is upon Moses, "and will put him upon them, and they shall bear the burden of the people with you, so that you will not bear it all alone." So it's not a different message, and it's not a different Spirit. Both at work in Moses and in the time of Paul. Now some of you may argue with me and say, Well, the Spirit wasn't working the same way. I'll be glad to talk with you later about that. I think it's very clear that the Spirit was. Now, what was new about the pouring out of the Spirit on Shavuot? That what was new is that the Spirit was going to give special power and ability to the disciples and their disciples and their disciples, and so forth and so on, to bring in the harvest of the nations. That had not happened before. A few Gentiles had come in all along, but now the Gentiles were going to come in mass. And the Spirit came to equip to do that. How do we know that that's a proper interpretation? What was the evidence of the Spirit at Shavuot in Acts chapter 2?
Speaking the language of the nations.
Speaking in all the languages. They all came and said, we're hearing it in our own language. Up until this time, the gospel had been given in Hebrew primarily. Now, it was going out in every nation. They didn't have to go to language school to learn all the different languages. They were going to be given the power to preach the message to all of the different families of the earth. The harvest was beginning. That was what was new about the pouring out of the Spirit. But the Spirit indwelling a person, regenerating the heart, giving faith to the person to believe, has always been His work for all those who came to faith in the Messiah. So, both Moses and Paul had the same message. Both Moses and Paul were empowered by the same Spirit. Then what made Paul's ministry effective and Moses' ministry ineffective to the people they taught? The difference is the veil. We keep seeing that word veil. Now let's study it. Let me ask you, we've already seen one, I told you about one example. That why did Moses put the veil over his face? Well, because he was embarrassed. He didn't want them to see that it was fading. Because the glory meant that he had been close to God, right? Now all of a sudden it's fading and he's going to become like everybody else, and he didn't want them to know that. So he put a veil over his face. What other explanations have you heard?
I thought he would be terrified. Here's this guy walking down his face. It's
Okay.
like, well,
Yeah, okay, they would be terrified. Okay, right. It's like, that's the wonderful thing about kids. I love to have kids in the teaching time because the kids are so truthful and so right on, right? Because as adults, if somebody comes in, if a guy comes in and he has a big mark on his face, and you've never met this person before, you don't say anything about it, right? You say, hi, my name's Tim. What's your name? Oh, glad to meet you. Glad you're here. And all the time in your head, you're thinking, I wonder how he got that big mark on his face. But you're not saying anything. And your little 3-year-old comes up and says, Daddy? I say, yeah. Why does that man have a big mark on his face? Yeah. And you go, shh, right? So, can you imagine Moses coming down off the mountain? His face is shining. And everybody's going, oh, Moses, how you doing? Good. Having a good day? Yeah, great. And little Yaakov says, Daddy, well, what happened to his face? And unless Moses had a mirror, apparently he didn't know until somebody said something, right? Yeah, look at your face. What's going on? So this is one of the explanations. He veiled his face so that people wouldn't be afraid. Another comment.
I was just curious, just thinking about this. Would it be similar to the veil in the tabernacle protecting people?
Okay. Okay. So.
Tim, if you walked through that door and your face was glowing like a light bulb, I think I'd be ready to head out of here.
Okay. So that's another option. He was afraid the shining of his face would cause people to be uncomfortable around him or even fear. Right?
He was unsure about what it would do to them too.
Okay. So he didn't want the people to see that glory was fading. He was afraid that the shining of his face would cause people to be uncomfortable. We can come up, but what does the Bible say? We can always go back to that. That's always the safe thing, right? All right. So let's go to Exodus 34 and let's read it. All right. So this is the text. And it came about when Moses was coming down from the mountain, and the 2 tablets of the testimony were in his hand, as he was coming down from the mountain, that Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because of his speaking with him. He hadn't looked in a mirror yet. He didn't know. So, when Aaron and all the sons of Israel saw Moses, behold, the skin of his face shone, and they were afraid to come near to him. Maybe that's why. Then Moses called to them, and Aaron and all the rulers in the congregation returned to him, and Moses spoke to them. So no, he didn't put a veil on yet. He just said, wait a minute. Don't be afraid. Come on back. And they say, oh, okay. Now they're not afraid anymore. They're coming back and they're talking to each other. So that one doesn't work either. And afterward, all the sons of Israel came near, and he commanded them to do everything that the Lord had commanded them to do, had spoken to him on Mount Sinai. So the sons of Israel come near. They're not afraid of him. When Moses had finished speaking with them, he put a veil over his face. What? They're not afraid, right? He's not concerned that they're going to be uncomfortable. And, oh wait, it doesn't say anything about fading either. But whenever Moses went in before the Lord to speak with him, he would take off the veil until he came out. And whenever he came out and spoke to the sons of Israel what he had been commanded, the sons of Israel would see the face of Moses, that the skin of Moses' face shone, so Moses would replace the veil over his face until he went in to speak with him. Are you confused? Yes. It's like, wait a minute, Paul, what are you doing here? Okay, you're giving us, we're trying to figure this out. Well, let's summarize. What have we learned? An explicit reason for the veil is not given in Exodus. The people's fear is not overcome by Moses wearing the veil, but by him talking with them before he ever puts the veil on. Moses puts the veil over his face to hide the glory. Nothing indicates that the glory of Moses was fading. But Paul indicates the glory was fading. There we have it. It says, so that the sons of Israel would not look intently on the face of Moses because of the glory of his face fading as it was. And we have it again in verse 11. For if that which fades away was with glory, much more that which remains. And we have it again in verse 13. Israel would not look intently at the end of what was fading away. I don't do this very often, but I do it now. Beware of the translators. Okay? This word that is used, translated 3 times, fading or fading away, is katargeo. Now I know this is tough. Hang in here with me for a few more minutes. We'll get to it, all right? Katargeo. It's found 27 times in the apostolic scriptures. 25 of them are in Paul. So this guy likes this word, and he knows what it means. In every case that Paul uses the word, it means to abolish, to annul, to render ineffective, or bring to nothing. But it never means to fade. Ever. And I have looked in extra-biblical Greek to see if I could find any author that used katargeo to mean fade, and I can't find one instance. How in the world did the translators come up with fade? I don't know. Here's some examples where Paul uses the same word. Do we then nullify the Torah through faith? May it never be. On the contrary, we establish the Torah. Romans 6:6. Knowing this, that our old self was crucified with him, that our body of sin might be done away with. Not fading away, but done away with, that we should no longer be slaves to sin. 1 Corinthians 15:24. Then comes the end when he delivers up the kingdom to God and the Father, when he has abolished all rule and all authority and power. Not faded. Paul uses katargeo to describe the veil's purpose. What was the veil's purpose? The veil was put over Moses' face so they would not see the glory. Now the hard question is, why didn't Moses want them to see the glory? That's the difficult one. Let's go back to the little kid. The little kid sees Moses coming down the mountain. His face is shining. He gets a chance to talk to Moses. He says, Moses, you know your face is shining? He says, oh, my face is shining. Well, I didn't know that, but now that you tell me, I could understand it because I was up on the mountain talking with God. What's the next thing that 6-year-old's going to ask? Exactly. What does he look like? You were up there talking with God? Yeah. What's he look like? What would Moses have said? No, he wouldn't have.
He saw face to face.
Exodus 24 says, Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 elders went up to Mount Sinai, and they saw the God of Israel. That's what it says. Rabbis don't like that phrase. They say they saw a form, they saw the glory, but it doesn't say they saw the form of the glory. It says they saw the God of Israel. And then it says, and under his feet was a sea of glass. The God of Israel has feet? Who did Moses see on Mount Sinai? He saw Yeshua. The glory shining from Moses' face was the very glory of Messiah. Now, the end in our text means the goal. What was the goal? He put a veil over his face so that they wouldn't see the end or the goal of the glory, which is Yeshua. The veil rendered the glory ineffective. It didn't make it fade, so that the glory would be ineffective, so that Yeshua would be hidden. You say, Tim, I'm not sure that makes any sense. Why would God hide Yeshua's glory? The people had demonstrated a heart of idolatry. Some have suggested that. But the most and the best answer is simply this. God has a mysterious plan of salvation, one that encompasses all the nations. In some way, the hardening of Israel was the means necessary to send the gospel to the nations. Paul says it in Romans 9 through 11. He says, I don't understand this. This is a mystery. I'm paraphrasing. I think Paul would say, I would never have done it this way. But there's a partial hardening that has come upon Israel so that the Gentiles would be brought in. Still, Paul ends by saying God intends to save Israel in the last days. He hasn't given up on Israel. Don't think he has. Isaiah spoke of the same thing. He said, go and tell this people, keep on listening but do not perceive. Keep on looking but do not understand. Render the hearts of this people insensitive, their ears dull, and their eyes dim, lest they see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and return and be healed. And we discover that Yeshua uses the same thing in Mark 4:11, and he said unto them, that is to the disciples, unto you is given the mystery of the kingdom of God. But unto them that are without, all things are done in parables, that seeing they may see and not perceive, hearing they may hear and not understand, lest haply they should return again and it should be forgiven them. Yeshua said one of the reasons I speak in parables is because it veils the message. When Paul ends Romans 11, he says, who can understand this? It's a mystery. Why would God do that? So the veil was put over Moses' face so that the glory would be hidden. Only when the Ruach opens the eyes of faith, takes away the veil, is Yeshua seen. The same is true of the Torah. When the Torah is veiled, that is, when there's no faith, Yeshua is not seen. When it is veiled, that is, there is faith, Yeshua is seen. You see, Paul does a beautiful kind of midrash here. Why? Because when you have a Torah scroll and you take it out, and you parade it around, you open it up and you read it, you can say, we're reading the Torah scroll. You can also say, we're reading Moses. We can say the Torah says, or we can say, Moses says. Right? Now let's see if we can make the metaphor work, the midrash work. Moses is veiled so that they don't see the glory in Moses. And every time they open up the Torah and read it, Moses is veiled. They don't see the glory there. Can you imagine what must have happened in the life of the Apostle Paul? How often had he read the Torah? How often had he studied it? And then he got knocked off his ride on the way, right, to Damascus, on the road. And he comes to the realization that the one he had persecuted was indeed the Messiah. And after he has his sight restored to him, he must have said to himself, you have to believe he said to himself, how could I have missed this? Now, can you just sit with Paul for a minute and start reading from Breshit 1? from Genesis 1? And he comes to Genesis 15 in verse 6, and it says, and Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. He goes, how did I miss that? Abraham believed, and it was counted to him for righteousness. It's by faith. How did I miss that? In fact, when we read Romans 7, we have a very interesting text where it says, I once was alive, and then the commandment came and I died. At what point in Paul's life had the commandment not come? He started studying Torah probably when he was 5 years old. But it was veiled. It was hidden. Only the Spirit of God takes away the veil. And I tell you something, when the Spirit of God takes away the veil, you know who you see in the Torah? You see Yeshua time and time and time and time again. Paul said to the Galatians that the very way, why was the Torah given? Why was the law given, is the way your English Bibles translate it in chapter 3. Why the Torah then? It was given on behalf of transgressions. And that's how people, they interpret it to mean, because Israel was so bad, God gave them this, this shackle on their feet called the Torah. No, that's not what it means. What it means is God gave the Torah as a means to explaining how he was going to deal with transgression. And how does the Torah teach that? Go take a lamb without blemish, without spot. Put your hands on his head. Transfer your guilt to him. Now, slaughter that lamb, catch the blood, give it to the priest, burn it up on the altar. Every picture of how God saves a sinner was given to us first in the Torah. But it's veiled unless the Spirit takes away the veil. So the same veil stays over the Torah right now. I was talking to my brother, they had to leave. He was talking about witnessing to people. What's the best way to witness to anyone, really, but also including Jewish people, even religious Jewish people? Get them to read the Bible. I was on the airplane. I was going, I forget where I was going this time, but I was on the airplane. There were a bunch of Jewish guys in the back, and they saw me come in with kippah on, and one of them came up and said, Shalom, Shalom Aleichem. I said, Aleichem Shalom. He said, we're going to study Torah in the back. You want to study with us? I said, sure. I knew what they were going to study. They weren't going to study the Bible. They were studying the page of Talmud for that day, the Daf Yomi. A lot of religious Jewish people don't read the Bible. They don't study the Torah. They study things about the Torah that their rabbis wrote. So the best thing we can do is give them the Bible and pray that the Spirit will take the veil away. When the Spirit takes the veil away, I guarantee you what they're going to see there. They're going to see Yeshua in all of his glory. So, Moses is one and the same, symbolizing or used as the Torah. When the Torah is read without faith, that is, not seeing the glory of Yeshua there, it is nothing but letters. There's no more power in the Scriptures without the Spirit than there is power in Homer. Read Homer, it's letters on a page. Read the Bible, it's letters on the page. It has zero power to change your life until the Spirit of God opens your heart and plants it there and brings its reality to you. You all know that. Those of you that have come to faith, you know that. How many times have you been discouraged, downtrodden, and you go to the Scriptures and you start reading the Scriptures and they just come alive. They bring you new faith and new hope. And you get done reading that and you say, oh, Lord, thank you for your word. And another person will read that and say, that's so boring. What does that mean? Right? What is the difference? It's the Spirit of God doing his work. You see, for Paul, the letter by itself only kills. The letter and the Spirit. That's the new covenant, isn't it? It's the Torah, the letter, written on the heart by the Spirit. Same exact message. When the Ruach gives faith and the Torah is read, Yeshua, the goal of the Torah, is seen. Moses is unveiled. The difference is a matter of faith itself, the gift of God. Through faith. Here's an expanded translation. This is a paraphrase, like a commentary, okay? And by the way, I would never venture to translate the Bible. Really. I think one person translating the Bible, wow, you have to be some giant of a person to do that. I cannot believe how many translations are out there that are leading people astray. Be careful with translations, okay? Stick with standard translations. By and large, they're the best. Sure, there's some prejudices, but there is in every translation. Better yet, study Hebrew. Study Greek. You say, that's impossible. Look, I'm 45, I'm 55, I'm 65. Oh, baloney. Don't tell me that it's impossible. You can find your way home from wherever you are, right? Okay, so that means you know how to memorize at least that, right? You can memorize that. You can find your way in the languages. It's not so bad. And besides that, there's all kinds of helps. There's all kinds of things out there that if you say, well, I don't have time to learn the language or I don't have the ability, but that doesn't matter. Find out what is the language that's behind your translation. Do the work. You've got so many tools out there with your computer. With your computer, you can do stuff that nobody could do before, and you can do it in a few seconds. Don't settle just for any translation. Use a standard translation and then check it with other standard translations, and then go back and say, what does it really say? Dig in. You can do it. Here's an expanded translation. But if the ministry of death, in letters engraved on stones, came with glory in such a way that the sons of Israel could not look intently at the face of Moses because the glory of his face was rendered ineffective, how will the ministry of the Spirit fail to be even more with glory? For if the ministry of condemnation has glory, much more does the ministry of righteousness abound in glory. For indeed, what had glory, in this case, has no glory because of the glory that surpasses it. For if that which was rendered ineffective by being veiled was with glory, much more that which remains in plain sight is with glory. Right? So I'm translating that katargeo is rendered ineffective. Therefore, having such hope, we use great boldness in our speech and are not like Moses, who used to put a veil over his face so that the sons of Israel would not look intently at the goal of the glory which was rendered ineffective by being hidden. He put the veil so they wouldn't see. But their minds were hardened. Who hardened their minds? Right? But this is exactly what Paul said in Romans. A partial hardening has fallen out upon Israel. He's using the same terminology. Until this very day, at the reading of the Old Covenant, the same veil remains unlifted, and thus the glory of Yeshua is not seen, because it is removed in Messiah when one places faith in him. That is, the veil is removed when one places faith in him. But to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their heart. But whenever a person turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Liberty to do what? Liberty to obey Torah. Liberty is not the ability to do whatever you want to do. That's called bondage. Before we came to faith in the Messiah, we thought we were free to just sin and do whatever we wanted to do. No, we were slaves to sin. Now we're free. What is free? Free is the ability to do what God created us to do. The glory was not seen because it's veiled, because it is removed in Messiah when places his faith in him. But to this very day, when Moses is read, a veil lies over their heart. But whenever a person turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and so forth. Okay. We are transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as from the Lord the Ruach. What does that mean? It's like this. Paul says, when you see the glory in Moses' face, your face starts shining. When somebody looks at you and you live out and speak to them the glory of the Messiah, their face starts shining. That's how it gets transferred from glory to glory to glory to glory to glory. What did they say of the disciples? They said they took note with them that they had been with Yeshua. Right? They were like him. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing, in whose case the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelieving, that they might not see the light of the glory of the Messiah, who is the image of God. Now he comes right out and tells us who the glory is, right? In the very next chapter. For we do not preach ourselves, but Messiah, Yeshua as Lord, and ourselves as your bondservants for Yeshua's sake. For God, who said, light shall shine out of the darkness, is the one who shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face, not of Moses, but in the face of Messiah. So you can see how he's going back and forth between reading Moses, seeing Messiah there, the glory of Moses, the glory of the Messiah. Now he comes right out and tells us that it's the glory of the Messiah he's talking about, and it's the glory of God shining in the face of the Messiah. Now I know this is complicated, but can you just think back about 2 Corinthians 3 when people start telling you, say, wait a minute, it doesn't mean fading. It means to be rendered ineffective. Why would God render the glory ineffective? Whose glory was it? Who did Moses see on the mountain? He saw Yeshua. So let's summarize. The glory shining in Moses' face was the very revelation of the Messiah. Is that amazing? We find another mountain where Moses showed up and saw Yeshua's glory. Right? And don't think that the gospel writers didn't put that together. Moses up on the mountain of Sinai, Moses on the Mount of Transfiguration, saw the glory of God unveiled. This glory was rendered ineffective in terms of teaching Israel about the true Messiah by covering his face with a veil. If he hadn't covered his face, they would have asked him all kinds of questions. He would have said, yeah, I saw God and he was a man. He had feet. Say, no, God is not a man. I know that. I don't understand it. It's a mystery to me. Something's wrong here, but that's what I saw. And the proof that I saw it is the glory of my face. No, he covered it all. Those questions weren't asked. When God sovereignly takes away the veil, however, the glory of Messiah is seen in the Torah, just as we mentioned about Paul. Otherwise, the Torah is mere letters in stone. Now, I know I'm going quickly, but I know that you're tired. I'm tired too. But let's just finish this off, okay? So I've just got a few more slides left. And let's ask this question about what does Paul mean by Old Covenant? Because that's where we all started, right? We're talking about New Covenant, Old Covenant. Their minds were hardened for until this very day at the reading of the Old Covenant. So we know that it's something that's written. The same veil remains unlifted, and thus the glory of Yeshua is not seen, because it is removed in Messiah when one places faith in him. I'm adding those words. But to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their heart. But whenever a person turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. All right, so you can see the parallels. The reading of the Old Covenant is the reading of Moses. The same veil is the veil that was over Moses' face in the terms of hiding the glory. To this very day, at the reading of the Old Covenant, the same veil remains unlifted because it is removed in Messiah. When we parallel it with the next verse, but to this day, same phrase, whenever Moses is read, so it's the reading of the Old Covenant, a veil lies over their heart. Whenever a person turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. We see he simply says it twice, but in saying it twice, he explains himself. That's good Hebrew, right? In the same way that the veil over Moses' face prevented Israel from seeing the glory of Yeshua, so a veil remains over the heart of Israel when Moses is read and the glory of Yeshua is hidden. How does Paul use the word old? Knowing this, that our old self was crucified with him, that our body of sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves. 1 Corinthians 5:7, clean out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened. 2 Corinthians 5, therefore, if any man is in the Messiah, he is a new creature. The old things passed away, behold, new things have come. Ephesians 4, that in reference to your former manner of life, you lay aside the old self, which is being corrupted in accordance with the lusts of deceit. In fact, old, the word old in Paul always refers to one's life before faith in Yeshua. It talks about those things which shouldn't be in our life if we are believers. It talks about our manner of life before we were believers. Old is marked by disobedience and faithlessness. Old is that which dies with Messiah when one comes to faith. When one reads the Torah without faith, it is an old covenant to him. Meaning what? Paul uses Old Covenant to describe the covenant which they broke. It's the covenant that is not like the one God's making in the New Covenant. What's the difference? It's the same Torah. Old Covenant means a covenant which cannot bring life. It's the letter without the Spirit. It's the glory of the Messiah veiled. For Paul, the Old Covenant can never save. It is mere letters. It always condemns. In fact, Paul says, without the Spirit, the Torah just makes you sin more. Did you know that? Without the Spirit of God, the Torah makes you sin more. Why? Because without the Spirit, you might get the feeling that if I keep all this the way I should, I'll be just fine. Pride. Being deceived, etc., etc. It upsets some people when I say to them, when we're on discussing this kind of thing, I say, no one was ever saved in the Old Covenant. No one was ever saved by the Old Covenant. Everyone who is a member of the Old Covenant is condemned.
The definition of your Old Covenant, New Covenant, thereby, you're right in that, in saying that, but
Then I hope people ask me, what do you mean by Old Covenant?
well, that's exactly.
It's not time-bound.
You're referring to your,
Old Covenant is not time-bound. For Paul, this is the only time in the whole Bible the word Old Covenant is found. The phrase Old Covenant is found. What is he talking about? He's talking about reading He's talking about reading Moses without the Spirit. That's the Old Covenant.
but if reading Moses before Messiah with the Spirit, would they still be saved?
Absolutely.
So therefore.
That's not the old covenant.
That's not the Old Covenant.
By his definition, so like time frame,
No. Old and new have nothing to do with time frame.
so just because someone lived before Messiah does not mean that they were not saved.
No, they were saved precisely the same way as we are saved. And how do we know that? Because Paul uses Abraham and David as his prime examples in Romans 4.
Luke 13,
Pardon me?
Luke 13, it
Luke,
states
yeah.
Abraham,
Yeah, Luke 13, right.
and you'll not be let in.
Right. Right. No, it's the same. Yeah. I can't tell you how many times I have asked this question of people. When you have, those of you that grew up in the church or whatever, did you ever hear the teaching that people in the Old Testament were saved by keeping the law, and people in the New Testament are saved by faith in Jesus? And I can't tell you how many times numbers of hands go up. How could anyone teach that and read the Bible? Just read it once.
The reason they get that, I believe, is because of the sacrifices. When church members read
Then they haven't read Hebrews, have they? The writer of the Hebrews says, by the blood of bulls and goats where no transgressions were covered.
It's simply traditions we were taught, we believe it. Like you said, we don't read the scriptures.
Don't read the scriptures. Anybody reading Romans chapter 4 would say, wait a minute, Paul, are you telling me that Abraham and David were saved the same way you expect the Romans to be saved? Yes. How blessed is the man whose sins are covered. How blessed is the one to whom the Lord does not impute iniquity. That's David. By the way, I commend to you a study of that passage because he doesn't quote it exactly right. Well, he does quote it, but then he gives an interpretation which is just opposite. He says, therefore, righteousness is imputed. He doesn't say, he says, transgressions are not imputed. But Paul interprets it as righteousness being imputed. That tells us something about what Paul's thinking, right? Because he uses Abraham too. Abraham believed God, and literally in the Hebrew, it, which is a feminine particle, it, that is, it, meaning faith, was counted to him, reckoned to him, thought to him, considered to him as righteousness, for righteousness. His faith, not his works. Yeah, Paul.
So the problem we kind of see in today's world, especially those of us that came out of, I guess the expression we use today was that studied ourselves
Mm-hmm.
out of the Christian church, is that we have people believe they're in the covenant, but with no Torah. So in the past we had the Torah without the Spirit, and today we see all around us
We have the Spirit without the Torah.
the Spirit without the Torah.
Right, and guess what? Neither one of those work.
No.
God never intended it that way. The ro-
Without the Torah, are we really getting the right spirit?
That's what I would think. Like,
Yes, okay, good question and good point that was made. If we have the Torah without the Spirit, are we really getting the real Torah? No, you're getting the Old Covenant. You're getting letters without the Spirit. You're getting no more power. Now, I have to be careful here, but in terms of eternal salvation, you have nothing more than what you would get if you read Homer.
What about
Now,
vice versa?
let me explain this. Even in the midst of that, for the temporal blessings that God has promised, for those who read and seek to obey the Torah, it has been the foundation for a good society in many places, right? I mean, America was founded on a Judeo-Christian ethic, which was basically very Torah-centered. That's why you have to have more than one witness in order to bring justice. That's based right upon the Torah. You know, there's all kinds of jurisprudence that's based upon the Torah and even for those who don't believe and don't have any faith whatsoever, the Torah does have temporal blessings for those who read it and establish it. What I'm talking about and what Paul's talking about is having our sins forgiven, having eternal blessing.
What about having the Spirit without the law, though? Is that truly the...
I don't think you can have the Spirit without the Torah. And somebody's going to say immediately, wait a minute. What about all our wonderful, and I agree, what about all of our wonderful Christian brothers and sisters? Let me just say this, and we can talk about this more later because I know it's getting a little late. But a lot of our Christian brothers and sisters keep more Torah than we do. Let us not forget this. No one keeps Torah perfectly. When Yeshua tells us when he returns, and in Matthew 25, what does he say? Did you have your theology right? Were you wearing tzitzit? Did you have a mezuzah on the door? How were you doing about keeping Shabbat? Now, all of those things are very important to Yeshua. But where does he center us? He says, I was naked and you clothed me. I was in prison, you visited me. I was sick and you came to me. I was hungry and you fed me. When did we do this? So before we start casting any fingers and pointing at our Christian brothers and sisters about whether or not they have the Spirit in keeping Torah, we ought to be careful to know that the weightier matters of the Torah, Matthew 23, are what many of our good brothers and sisters in the church are keeping, and they're doing it well. Now, I'm not going to put any percentage on that. Okay, I'm not trying to do that, but I'm just saying we ought to be careful that we not point fingers, but remember that when we do, there's three more pointing back at us, and we ought to be saying, Lord, let me be fully a servant of yours. May your Spirit write again and again and again the Torah upon my heart, so that I'm convicted about things that I should be convicted about, that I have power to walk in the Ruach, to be that person you want me to be the husband you want me to be, the wife. Look, there's nothing more powerful than solid marriages and families to show forth the glory of God. This is what's so wonderful about homeschooling. I was standing in line, excuse me for preaching. I was standing in line at the post office because we send things all the time to the post office. And a mother and two boys came in. And both of these boys were orderly. They were standing in line. And one of them turned around and said, sir, called me sir. That's unreal. Okay, called me sir. Said, sir, could I ask you about what you have on your head? I said, absolutely. I said, it's called a kippah or yarmulke in Yiddish. This is what it means. It's a sign of a Jewish man and so forth and so on. He said, so you're Jewish? I said, yes. I looked at the mother. I said, homeschooled, huh? I mean, here was a young boy that wasn't afraid in a polite way to talk with a stranger, to talk intelligently, and to inquire about something they needed to inquire about. This is powerful. This is the hope for the next generation. This is true hope and true change. Excuse me for a USAism. That was promised to us. That was promised to us in the last election. Yeah. So, I mean, this is where we need to center our attention, not how do you tie. I mean, it's important. We can talk about how we tie our tzitzit and why we wear them, how we put a mezuzah on the door. We can talk about how we keep the festivals. These are wonderful things, and we ought to talk about them, and they ought to be important to us. But we ought to equally talk about, are we being faithful to each other? How are we doing with the issue of gossip? How are we doing with divisive spirits? How are we doing about loving our enemies, praying for those who despitefully use us? How are we doing with that? That's where the Torah really shines forth, in the greater, the weightier matters of the Torah. We sometimes tend to spend a lot of time on the lighter matters, the easy ones. It's easy to put a mezuzah on the door. It's easy to wear tzitzit. Right? It's hard to love your enemy. It's hard to forgive somebody who sinned against you. It's hard to humble yourself and serve your wife when she is acting in a way that you don't think she deserves to be served. And it's hard for a wife, me, submit to him? Are you kidding me? That's hard. That's tough. And when we do, we show forth the glory of God. So all who think that there is life in the Torah apart from Yeshua are part of the old covenant. That's what Paul's saying. You're reading the Torah the way you always have. He's saying to these Jewish people, you have no faith in the Messiah. You have no Spirit of God. That letter is not getting you anything by way of eternal salvation. So let's see the contrast. The new covenant has Torah on the heart. It results in faithfulness. We're delivered from our sin and our iniquities. The Spirit is active. We are forgiven, and Yeshua is known. What's the old covenant? The letter only. It's broken, right? We engaged in idolatry and still do. Those who have not given themselves wholly and fully to Yeshua, perishing. The Ruach is absent. There's condemnation, and Yeshua is veiled. That's the contrast. What's the conclusion? The Old Covenant is not related to time. At any time, whenever the Torah is separated from faith in Yeshua, it is an old covenant. It's a covenant that is without faith. The goal of the Torah is Yeshua. His glory is veiled in the Torah whenever the Ruach is not actively revealing him. And here is the issue. It is the Ruach's decision in accordance with what the Father, in accordance with what Yeshua is interceding. It's the sovereign work of God to unveil the glory of God in the Torah. You and I can't do it in the hearts of people. The Spirit has to do it. And so what does this tell us? We ought to be on our knees, whether we actually physically are, that's fine, but you understand what I mean. We ought to be before the Lord saying, Lord, try praying this prayer. Maybe you have many times. I hope you have. But if you haven't, try praying this prayer. Start praying it all the time. Lord, bring into my path the people that you're preparing for me to witness to about Yeshua. Bring into my path. You bring them. I'm praying and praying and praying. You bring them. And the next time you're at the grocery store and somebody talks to you you've never met, you should say, Lord, is this one? Open the conversation. I cannot tell you how many times people have just asked me crazy questions in places I never could have imagined. Just the other day at the post office again, they always ask this question, is there anything that's dangerous or hazardous or so forth and so on in your package? And I made the comment, no. But I want to tell you something, the Word of God is powerful. And it's in there. And as I was going out the door, somebody said to me, I understand what you meant, and I really appreciate you saying that. That was very helpful. I say, well, Lord, is that one? I planted a little seed. Who's going to water it next? Somebody's seeking. Somebody's waiting. Let us be before the Lord saying, Lord, bring that person into my life so that by your Spirit you'll unveil and I'll have the opportunity to unroll the scroll and let them see Yeshua. So the goal of the Torah is Yeshua. The Old Covenant always condemns. No one's saved. The Old Covenant is marked by the letter. The Old Covenant is the letter written, or the New Covenant is the letter written on the heart by the Ruach. Why are we privileged to know Him? I can only say what Paul says. Why does a pot say to the potter, why'd you make me this way? In God's love, in God's eternal purpose, Paul says that grace was given to us in Him, in Yeshua, before the world began. Can you fathom that? I can't. Before you and I were ever created in the womb of our mothers, before anybody ever even thought about us, God had set his love upon us to make his Son known to us, so that we might be his witnesses, so that we might sanctify his name upon the earth, so that we might be the ones who shine the light of his glory to others. What a privilege to be part of this new covenant.